World Hunger Day serves as a stark reminder that global hunger is not only unresolved, it's getting worse. According to the 2025 Global Report on Food Crises, over 295 million people across 53 countries experience acute food insecurity. In Africa, intractable conflicts have made the situation worse. Millions of the displaced, many of them in refugee camps in Chad, Sudan, the DR Congo and Kenya, are on the brink of starvation. This week on the program, we examine what's driving the hunger crisis among refugees and what it will take to break the vicious cycle of conflict and hunger. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, let's take a closer look at how the crisis is unfolding across Africa. Let's begin in Sudan. The war has displaced more than 14 million people. Today, over 30 million Sudanese urgently need food, shelter, and medical assistance. Famine has already been declared in 5 regions and is threatening to spread across at least 17 more. It's the country's worst hunger crisis in living memory. In Kenya, the story is just as alarming. The 720,000 refugees living in Dadaab and Kakuma are now facing drastic cuts to food rations. Starting next month, cash support will end altogether. WFP says unless new funds are secured, the agency may no longer be able to keep food supply systems running. In DR Congo, years of conflict, particularly in the east, has created one of the world's largest displacement and hunger crises. About 28 million people are facing acute food insecurity, a figure among the highest globally. Some 7.8 million people have been forced to flee their homes, making DRC a country with one of the largest internally displaced populations. The hunger crisis in refugee camps across Africa is widespread and urgent. Now let's bring in our guests to help us further unpack the situation, from funding shortfalls to failed responses and possible solutions. Joining me here in Nairobi is Dorcas Wango, Humanitarian Response Coordinator, Oxfam in Africa. In Dakar via Zoom is Olosib, Senior Researcher, Assessment and Monitoring at the World Food Programme Regional Office in Dakar. And in Cape Town, we have Jervin Naidu, Political Analyst at Oxford Economics Africa. A warm welcome to you all and thank you very much for joining our discussion today. Olo, I will begin with you. Famine has been declared in 5 areas in Sudan and over 30 million people need urgent aid. How severe is the hunger crisis in Sudan?
The conflict in Sudan started years back in 2003. And since the outbreak of that conflict, the situation in Sudan has never been stable. We also noticed that the conflict in Sudan also affected many countries around Sudan, countries like Chad. And we were in Chad recently, and where we met with the Sudanese refugees. And basically you have 2 groups of Sudanese refugees. You know, the first group that we saw, they came, as I mentioned earlier, in 2003. And since 2003, they haven't been able to go back to Sudan because the situation there has not been stabilized. We also met the new wave of refugees fleeing Sudan after the outbreak of the recent conflict. And now this camps are overcrowded. And this is the situation of millions of refugees we have across Africa and West Africa. And they also live with host communities, and those host communities are already in a very dire food security situation.
Right. And, you know, although the world has been focusing on Sudan and what's happening there, but just like you mentioned, we have refugees all across the continent. So let me draw your attention to another crisis that has been quietly unfolding, and here in Kenya. There are close to 1 million refugees in Kenya's Dadaab and Kakuma camps, and those are not the only camps in Kenya. What is happening in Kenya? Why are refugees experiencing food rations? Why are those food rations being cut?
WFP continue to receive substantial support from its traditional donors. But the issue we face today is that the pace of the contribution and the volume and the quantity of the contribution that WFP is receiving is just outpaced by the importance and the significance of the need that we have to address. So WFP and many other humanitarian players are forced to cut the ration in order to provide to as many as possible. You know, this is a very hard, difficult decisions that we have to make. And on that regard, I just want to mention one interesting story that we you know, for us, it's important because these numbers you mentioned, behind each of these numbers, there are people, there are families, there are kids, there are women who are in that situation. And that story is related to the ration cut. So these are very difficult situations. Many of the refugees, WFP and other humanitarian actors are dealing with. It's links to the global constrained funding environment. But despite these challenges, we and others are making the best to make sure that we leave no one behind and that life-saving response and activities still on and reach the people when it's possible and where it's possible.
Right. So, Dorcas, you're here in Kenya. You're very familiar with what's happening in these refugee camps here. Let me just draw your attention to some warnings that WFP has issued recently. It has warned that without immediate financial support for refugees, in Kenya specifically, food aid will be cut to its lowest level on record. But this isn't just unique to Kenya, Dorcas. Why are people in refugee camps in Africa facing starvation now?
The alarming funding shortages mean that most of the resources have to be cut, and most vulnerable people have to fall and become even more vulnerable. So we are faced by a confluence of both immediate and systemic challenges. So starting with the funding cuts, but also being able to access the people who are suffering. As you know, that most of the drivers of what gets us into emergency situations is issues to do with climate change, but also conflict. So this has meant that people cannot farm, and that has also contributed to inflation. So economic challenges, so that even when people have money, they are not able to purchase food. So it's quite a number of issues, the conflict-driven disruptions that include destruction of livelihoods, displacement of families, and lack of access to markets. So I think this, with the ongoing food funding shortages, are going to make people even more and more vulnerable. And we are really calling for solidarity from governments, from international actors, to ensure that we are not reporting deaths and severe malnutrition.
Okay, so a myriad, of course, of reasons why this is happening. Jervin, let's pick up on one that Dorcas has highlighted, and that is conflicts. We've seen prolonged conflicts and displacements in Africa, in countries, just to mention a few, such as the DRC and Sudan. So what role has conflict played in driving this food crisis across the continent?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think just building on what Dorcas has said, I think we need to clarify to your listeners and viewers that also the food program Africa is made to seem like this poor child, but the thing is, in Africa we have enough food to feed the continent. We have enough net food exporters. The issue is, as Dorcas has mentioned, conflict is an issue, supply chains, things such as fertilizer. So I think it's really important to always remember that there is enough food on the continent. It's just about how do we get there. But then on to your question regarding conflict, Sudan and the Eastern DRC, which I cover extensively, the major problem with conflict is that it stops supply chains for food getting to the right places. And even when you have aid organizations such as the UN, Feed the Children, in South Africa we have Gift of the Givers, a lot of these organizations are blocked from giving aid off. Also, food is used as a tool in warfare. So a lot of these armed groups, particularly in Sudan and Eastern DRC, weaponize food as a tool to perpetrate crimes. So it's a really complex intersection between politics, conflict, and food. So like I'd mentioned, I'd like to say is that even though conflict is a big part of it, I think we need to look at how we can get food to other places by improving logistics, improving access to fertilizers, Because, like I said, even in these areas where there's conflict in Sudan, Eastern DRC, there's enough arable land for people to grow their own food. So it's a whole messy picture, if I have to put it like that.
Right. So, Olo, now that we are talking about this hunger crisis, you've pointed us a picture of what's really happening in these refugee camps, and this is affecting the most vulnerable in Africa. Is this crisis getting enough global attention, the hunger crisis?
Our feeling is that the level of the magnitude of the crisis that we are facing across the continent are not well understood across, and even within the continent, but also outside the continent. In the Sahel, we mentioned DRC, we mentioned Kenya and other countries, but also we have the Sahel, a huge part of Africa that is being affected by a decade of violence and conflict, with thousands of people who have been forcibly displaced. And I just want to draw your attention on two things. And it has been raised, but I think it's very important: the interconnection between the conflict, the poverty, food insecurity, and climate change. Those four elements and things are linked, and it's important that those issues are addressed at local level, but most importantly, at global level. The consequences of climate change cannot be tackled by any individual countries. It has to be tackled globally. So let's find global solutions to tackle those issues and put the focus on the region that are the most affected, and make sure that the communities that are also the most affected are reached. Because, you know, the first responder to food crisis are not the international communities, or are not coming from abroad. It's the local community, it's the host government. So it's important also to give the means to the host government, to the local communities, to tackle the issue. And of course, the role of the international community is to come all together. So the international solidarity is important, but again, the communities are there, the host governments are there. Let's give them the strength, the capacity to tackle that food issue.
Okay, so we will talk about those local solutions. By local, I mean solutions driven by the continent itself. But Dorcas, there was something you mentioned earlier when you're explaining to us, you know, what's contributing to this crisis we're seeing now. And one of the factors you mentioned was donor funding. I mean, there's been funding cuts. But help us understand, who are the main donors traditionally supporting food aid in Africa, and why are they cutting back?
Indeed, I think we have mainly relied on traditional donors who are mainly government donors. For instance, we have greatly relied on the support from the US government that has been able to support most of the response plans in Africa by up to over 60%. And so any cut from them has been quite significant. We have also relied on like FCDO, we have relied on ECHO, that have been very generous in the past. But given the growing geopolitics, we are seeing a shift in terms of how aid is being given. And aid is being more politicized. And at times, you know, looking at interest and not looking at really doing the right thing. So really what we have seen in the past and in the political formations is that most of the governments have moved to the right wings, and so the aid and the support towards it has really changed and has been politicized. And so what this means for us as Africa is the need to look for local solutions. How do we ensure that we are addressing the climatic drivers? How do we address the conflict drivers? But how do we stand in solidarity at the AU level, at the regional economic communities? What are the local solutions that we can mobilize? But I would also say that there are other allies outside the usual traditional donors that we probably should start to look at and see if they can also be able to step up and support.
Okay, so Jervin, it's projected that funding for food-based humanitarian work will fall by 45%. This affects everything. We're talking food procurement, delivery, staffing, and even access to hard-to-reach areas. How much has humanitarian funding been cut globally, and how is that impacting Africa?
Yeah, so as Dorcas has mentioned, the big shift is obviously with the new presidency in the US aid being cut, which is a significant driver of aid. We've seen similar parts fallen by European governments who give a lot of money to aid. So generally there's been this sort of move away from aid where there's an emphasis now on African countries to provide their own aid. So there's been a significant reduction in aid. So I think this also then provides an opportunity. While it's a bit dire in the sense that, oh, we're having this aid cut, it's maybe a time for the African governments themselves to look at where we can internally get funding and make these plans. Additionally, also another way of looking at it, and I think it's following up to your question slightly on what Dorcas and bringing to mind, is that maybe African governments should maybe look at maybe more technical partnerships. So for example, in Ethiopia, where there are also issues of a food crisis with ongoing conflicts in that country, the problem is they have a problem with access to fertilizer. So if European or Western governments, or even moving towards the East, Chinese government could assist with those kind of, getting more technical support on how to deal with climate change, I think those are good ways to negate the actual monetary value of aid. So I think we should maybe start again, like I mentioned earlier, rethinking about how we can reposition aid in Africa.
On that note, let's take a short break. And when we return, we will look at Africa's options as traditional humanitarian aid sources dry up. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa, and let's continue with the discussion. Still with me is Dorcas Wango, Olo Seb, and Javi Naidu. Now, Olo, what is being done now to address the hunger crisis in affected areas? You talked of Sudan, what's happening there, in Chad, the crisis unfolding, and even the Sahel region, not of course forgetting the DRC. So what's happening now to address this crisis?
The solution to the food crisis, it's a combination of building on the endogenous solutions and communities, building community resilience with the support of the international community. I mentioned the case of Sahel. As we speak, 52 million people are food insecure in the Sahel. Last year in 2024, WFP reached 20 million. This year, during the peak of the lean season, WFP is planning to reach 5 million people. Of course, this requires roughly 700 million US dollars. But this is life-saving activity. Life-saving activity is important. It must come first, but it's not enough. What we need is to invest into long-term solutions, building on what the communities are already doing themselves. And that's what we call the integrated resilience package, whereby we help communities, for instance, in the Sahel, in Kenya, in AMU, where land have been degraded due to the consequence of climate change, or maybe the land has been overused, to rehabilitate those lands. And millions of hectares have been rehabilitated. The rehabilitation of croplands in Africa is extremely important because that's the way we guarantee that farmers have access to fertile land they can use, they have access in the secure locations. In the case of the Sahel we mentioned, this program contributed to almost take out from food insecurity 400,000 people across the Sahel. So the solutions are there. They have been, I will say, piloted, but what we need today in Africa is to bring all these solutions together, put them at the right scale, so that we can build a food system that is feeding Africa. And the food system that is feeding Africa will include that we look at the production, and that's why land rehabilitation is important, access to fertile land is important. It's also important that we look at the whole chain after the production, the transportation, the logistic chain, but also the distribution. And you know, most of the vulnerable people, the refugees that we mentioned, the internally displaced people that we mentioned, live in the most remote part of the continent. And for them, the functioning of the supply chain is important so that the food can reach them despite the security challenges, the road conditions. We must ensure that free movement of food and goods is a reality in Africa so that we sustain our food system.
Yeah, that speaks to what Dorcas had mentioned earlier about local solutions. So Dorcas, where else can Africa look for support if traditional donors pull back?
Before I go to where Africa should look for support, I think we also need to look at being able to address the root causes of the crisis that we find ourselves in. And like I mentioned, for instance, conflicts, I think these are things that can be reversed and things that can be addressed in Africa so that we give ample time for our people to go back to their homes and do farming. The land is productive, we can be able to feed ourselves. So there are those things that we need to address sustainably. But currently, because we still need to address the, the needs that are presented there, knowing that we are producing more emergencies that are outpacing the funding that we continue to receive, I think there is need then to continue looking for funding that can be able to, cover the gaps that are there. And one of them would actually be looking internally and mobilizing the capacities that we have in Africa. These are opportunities for local fundraising. We have billionaires in Africa who would be able to stand in solidarity with other Africans within the continent. There's also an opportunity to look for private partnerships with the private sector, because they do have a lot of innovative solutions that may not be as costly. But thirdly, I think there are also allies that Africa can engage with. So outside the traditional donors, there are other emerging ones that are coming up, I think, so looking at the Gulf, looking at China. So what are those other sources where we have strategic alignments, where we can also try and, try and do fundraising where there are those alignments?
So, Jervin, as we talk about solutions and how best we can tackle these hunger crises in the continent, one of the drivers of this, of course, is conflict, which exacerbates the humanitarian crisis in the camps. And also, apart from that, this is what Olo talked about, just these homegrown solutions. He said the food is there. We have countries that produce, but we need to link up these markets. So I think my question for me is, why aren't African governments doing more? Number one, to end these conflicts that in the first place caused this crisis, but also to implement these solutions that Olo talked about that seem to be really available and within reach.
Conflict in Africa are driven by various things, whether it be different factions fighting over control, over resources. A lot of tensions in Africa can be traced back to colonial times, which have been exacerbated by poor post-independence government. So it's really challenging. So I can't sit here and tell you this is the solution, that we must just come together. It's like these are really deep-seated, challenging ones. And the problem is when a country is fighting, so for example in Sudan, where you have two different factions trying to fight over control, the immediate targets of these governments are not necessarily to secure food for their people, but trying to gain control of territory or gain power. And I think this is why you then have these things such as the food crisis, where, for example, in these countries that are war-torn, the governments tend to then worry about, okay, I just need to make sure my soldiers have food, they have supplies, that I can fight a war. They're not necessarily worried about refugees or civilians that get harmed. Answering the question to conflict is the golden question in Africa. I think the African Union's plan called Agenda 2063, which their main goal is to silence the gun on the continent. So until you don't address conflict, you're going to continuously have this problem of where there's wars, and then you're going to have famine, wars and famine. And obviously, as your other two colleagues have mentioned, climate change. We need to address climate change. So all of these together, this is why we require what is considered a human security approach, a broad-based approach to addressing food security.
Okay, so Olo, you talked extensively about the solutions that can be applied here, but are there any African-led initiatives that are currently working to address food security?
The political will is an important piece of the solution. The commitments are made, and we need the political will to transform this commitment into action an action that yields fruit. And the fruit that we are expecting for Africa is food on the table of the Africans. One important thing that we noticed, and we are part of a broad network on food crisis prevention. And the recent meeting that we had, we were surprised to see that there were no decision makers in the room, while we were expecting to have decision makers. I mean, it's important to bring the decision makers, and so that the solutions that are out there, because the solutions are there, they have been there for a while, are now transformed into action. The issue of food security in Africa is not availability issue. We mentioned it different occasions. Food is there, food is being produced, but those who are food insecure is because they don't have access. They don't have the means to access. So the affordability of food in Africa is an issue. A minimum meal in Africa costs 40% higher compared to the same meal you buy in Asia. So then how many Africans can afford those foods? So it's just now the time to act and tackle the emergency need that we have now, but use the emergency response as a foundation and build on that to strengthen resilience, strengthen our food system, so that we will rely less on imported food and international aid.
Okay, and Dorcas, my final question to you. I think earlier on, it was depressing to me, quite frankly, hearing Olo talk about food costs in Africa being 40% higher than in Asia. I mean, millions of Africans cannot really afford that. So what is the future of those in the camps who are the continent's most vulnerable?
One of the reasons why the cost of food has become very expensive is, like we have constantly mentioned, that Africa is very productive, but for the people to be able to produce that food, where do you find them? You find them in the refugee camps because of the conflict, so they are not able to reproduce. And when there is no production happening, of course, then the inflation goes up and people cannot afford the food. So if we can be able to address those things, it would ensure that people are being able to access the food, but also investments by the government in terms of infrastructure, for instance, for irrigation projects, to ensure that those who have remained and are able to continue farming, they would be able to do that. Also looking at regional collaborations. What is it that the different regional economic communities can work closely to ensure that, you know, the overflowing issues of refugees that are happening, they are able to be addressed in a more sustainable manner. So how can we equip the people? There's also the need to continue advocating for sovereignty. How can we reduce reliance on imports? How can we ensure that people are well enhanced and are well facilitated to be able to produce? And even for those who are in the refugee camps, you can imagine that there are people who are already in the refugee settlements for over 18 years. So would they continue relying on emergency food that is being distributed? How do we shift towards ensuring that we are moving towards durable and sustainable solutions, so that as we continue to support them, then there are still ways that we are looking to ensure that there's sustainability in all that we are able to do.
All right, thank you very much, Dorcas, for that. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our guests, Dorcas Wango, Humanitarian Response Coordinator at Oxfam in Africa, Olo Sib, Senior Researcher, Assessment and Monitoring at the World Food Programme Regional Office in Dakar, and Javin Naidu, Political Analyst at Oxford Economics Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.